Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to Barsetshire Week. For the whole of this week, I'm going to be talking about Anthony Trollope's brilliant book series, The Barchester Chronicles. This week is going to be somewhat similar in structure to my general author weeks that I've done before, where I talk about all of the books by a particular author in order from my least favourite to my favourite, going over 1 week or two. I've done this before with Jane Austen, with Charles Dickens, with Elizabeth Gaskell, with the Brontes and with Thomas Hardy. I'll link down below all of those playlists. Now, I would really love to do a author week / month on Anthony Trollope, but unfortunately he wrote 45 novels and I have read about 10, so I have a long way to go with Anthony Trollope. But a subscriber suggested to me that I do a Barsetshire week instead, talking about the 6 books in Anthony Trollope's Barchester Chronicles series, and I thought that I would because I love that series so much and it's always a joy to talk about Anthony Trollope. And as with all my previous author weeks, the videos will all be spoiler free, which means that sometimes if there are like central characters or premises in books that are slight spoilers to previous books, I might be a bit vague, so if you've read them and you're wondering why I'm being a bit vague, that's why. But yes, no spoilers in any of these videos. I have made a video before just about my general thoughts on Anthony Trollope called Let's Talk About Anthony Trollope, so I'll link that down below as well. So every day this week I'm going to be talking about a different novel in the Barsetshire Chronicles. Now, unlike my previous author weeks, I'm not going to do these in order from my least favourite to my favourite, partly because I find it hard to rank them and partly also because the series is in an order and I do think you have to read them in the order, so it doesn't make sense for me to talk about them out of order. So there are 6 books in the Barchester Chronicles. Tomorrow I'll be talking about The Warden, then I'll be talking about Barchester Towers, then I'll be talking about Dr. Thorne, then I'll be talking about Framley Parsonage, then I'll be talking about The Small House at Allington, and then I'll be talking about The Last Chronicle of Barset. Those are the 6 books. If you do want to know my order of preference, I can give that to you, even though I won't be doing the series in that order. My favourite book in the Barsetshire Chronicles, without a doubt, is The Small House at Allington. That's number 1. Then, like joint second, is The Last Chronicle, Framley Parsonage and Barchester Towers. Then would probably be The Warden, and then Dr. Thorne is probably my least favourite in the series. Don't let that put you off, it's most people's favourite in the series, but that is my basic order. But I thought what I'd do today, before I individually review those 6 books in the next week, is talk a bit in general about the series and what I love so much about it. The Barsetshire Chronicles is a series of 6 books, but one of the things I love so much about it is that it's not exactly a regular series. It's more of a series of interconnected novels. The novels have different central plot lines and different central characters, but they're all set in this fictional Victorian county of Barsetshire, and they all deal with characters who overlap, so various characters who are main characters in one book will crop up as minor characters in another book. The Warden and Barchester Towers are probably like the most directly linked in that a lot of the characters in Barchester Towers featured in The Warden, though there are many new characters that turn up in Barchester Towers, and the rest of the series from there are kind of linked to each other in subtle ways, and then the last book kind of brings so many of the previous books together in a glorious, glorious way. I love that a lot. Partly it's because I love interconnected short story collections, and minor characters cropping up in other people's stories is like one of my favourite things about them, so I love it in novels too. And I also think it's just a really, really brilliant way of doing it, and it also makes it feel so real. It makes the series feel like it's set in a real place, and it's also incredibly rewarding to read. As a reading experience, I think there are few things I've ever read that are as rewarding to read as the Barchester Chronicles, because they link in such clever small ways, and they link, as I've already mentioned, in terms of characters, but they also link a lot in themes, which I'll talk about a bit later. In terms of the series being an interconnected series of novels, I have heard people say that you don't have to read them in order, and I would highly, highly disagree. Basically, there are some of the books, particularly I would say Dr. Thorne and The Small House at Allington, that you could read without having read any of the rest of the novels, and they would make sense to you perfectly, you would get the story, you would really enjoy them. But if you ever intend to read all 6 books, you have to read them in order from The Warden through to The Last Chronicle, because each book in some way spoils the last, even so much as like giving the married names of people who you then know who they're going to marry early on. Like, there's so many. I just think you have to read them in order to get the proper experience. Like I said, there are some that you can read on their own, but if you ever want to read the entire series, you really, really must read them in order, and I can't stress that enough. Like, I think it's just so much more rewarding, especially because I think Anthony Trollope is like a brilliant master of plot, and so it's really nice to not be spoiled for the plots of the books. But yes. One thing I would also say in reading them is that my advice would be to read The Warden and then immediately read Barchester Towers. Like, treat them as though they were one book. The Warden's quite short. Read them in quick succession, because The Warden, though I love it, is not the most accessible in the series. It is in fact the least accessible in the series, but it is the first one, and I think quite a lot of people read The Warden, find it a bit dry and don't read on. I really like The Warden, but I do think it's worth reading Barsetshire Towers quickly afterwards, because I think that will get you into the series a bit more. I mentioned in my Let's Talk About Anthony Trollope video the things I love about Anthony Trollope, but specifically in terms of the Barsetshire series, I think they're very, very accessible to read. I think they're quite funny and quite engaging, with often a sort of light tone, and although he does deal with a lot of serious themes, I do think they are very, very readable. I love Anthony Trollope's writing style, I love his humour, I love his characterisation, I love his focus on realism. He's very different to a writer like Dickens, who I also love, or like the Brontes, who deal a lot with kind of gothic and with sort of exaggerated characters. I think Anthony Trollope goes to great lengths to sort of create realist characters, and I know other people have said to me as well that they think he writes female characters much better than a lot of other male Victorian authors, which I completely agree about. Much as I love Dickens, I think Anthony Trollope writes better female characters as a whole than Dickens does, and in general I think his characters are so sort of realistically and wonderfully portrayed, and there are some brilliant characters in the Barsetshire Chronicles. In fact, one thing I love about the series as a whole, which this sort of structure of interconnected novels works sort of brilliantly for, is that there are some characters who you meet early on in the series and you sort of half get, but you don't entirely know, and then later on in the series they'll come back and you'll come to a much greater understanding of them. For example, a character like Mrs. Proudie in Barsetshire Towers, or possibly Mrs. Proudie. In my head I always thought it was Proudie, but it might be Proudie. I've heard other people say Proudie. Her. Anyway, the bishop's wife. She's intensely dislikable, but there are moments in the last Chronicles of Barset where you get her, and suddenly it falls into place and you understand why she is like she is, and yeah, you have to wait several books for it, but it's like even more rewarding for that, so that's good. Anyway, another thing I love about the series as a whole is the themes that it plays with. There are a lot of themes that run throughout multiple books in the series. One major theme is that of family opposition to marriage and sort of cross-class marriage. There's a lot of kind of upper-class characters wanting to marry middle-class characters and their family objecting to that, and the sort of way that affects those particular characters. That's a kind of reoccurring motif and plotline in several of the books. And at times we also have the opposite. We have families really keen for a particular marriage that the people they're trying to push together are not so keen on. And that kind of exploration of the role of family in marriage and the sort of tension between the wishes of young people and the wishes of their parents is really, really interesting. One of the very important themes in the Barsetshire Chronicles is that of religion and the church, and differences within the church, for example, especially between sort of high and low church and church politics. Now, for a lot of people, like, I understand that this is not everyone's main interest. I'm very interested in Victorian church politics because I'm very interested in the Victorian period, but I know not everyone is. But at the same time, I think Anthony Trollope does it so well, and so often it is very relatable in other ways. I remember chatting to Marissa from Blatantly Bookish about Barsetshire Towers, and her saying that the church politics in there feels very like office politics today, and that I think is very, very true. And so in many ways, even if you don't think you're interested in Victorian church politics, explored in so many interesting ways that it is still fascinating. And the kind of divisions within religion and the politics of religion and the politics of the church and the different ways people react to their role as clergymen is really, really interesting. And I also love the way that the books deal with issues of morality, and especially with religion and morality and religious figures and morality, with basically the question of, is a clergyman more moral than other people, and should they be? 4 of the 6 books have at their heart a character who is a clergyman, and this idea of morality and the moral duty you owe as a clergyman, of how moral you should be when you are representing the church and morality but are also human at the same time, is really, really interesting and really, really important to the series as a whole, and such a sort of interesting and important question. There are so many other themes in this series that are wonderful. There are a lot of brilliant, heartbreaking, wonderful love stories. There are a lot of themes about individual expression, personal choice, identity, gender issues, and then also in individual books there are so many interesting, important themes of illegitimacy, themes of alcoholism, themes of grief and loss, themes of marital discontent. Like, there are so many interesting things going on in this series as a whole, and I can't tell you to read them enough. You should go and read them, please, everybody, please. And if you started and not got far, like, you must continue, because the 5th book in the series, A Small House at Allington, is genuinely one of the best books I've ever read. So go read the whole series, please do that. Right, I think that's all I have to say for today. Tomorrow I'll be back to talk about The Warden, which is the first book in the Barsetshire Chronicles. So thank you very much for watching, and yes, I'll be back tomorrow to talk about the first book in the Chronicles of Barsetshire.